too much. It's a different game when you're looking at, I'm going to play at a Middlebury, or I'm going to play at an Amherst, or I'm going to play at
D3 non-scholarship.
D3 non-scholarship, or I'm going to play at a Harvard or Yale, right? Where they're going to consider your academic profile, your athletic prowess, and whether you're a sponsored, what's called a sponsored athlete. Those universities don't have scholarships, athletic scholarships, but they do have students that go into the academic admissions and say, we want these 5 students to come and play here, and here's why they're special, and their academics don't matter as much because of that. But there's still a floor on what those academics can be, right? So you can't, just because you're a great basketball player or you're great whatever, doesn't mean you can get into Yale with an 800 on your SAT. You still have to have a reasonable score on it. And it considers that overall academic profile, including your transcripts, including your athletic prowess. We'll talk a little bit about extracurriculars. That's just considered something that makes you special, right, from the other student body. So, yeah.
I have a question for you then. Would you say on average, because you've been doing this for a while, when you get a situation, and I don't know if you've seen, a situation of a freshman being recruited, but when you see recruiting happening early on, is it typical that you get students who really just need content tutoring because they simply haven't learned the subject that's being covered in the SAT? Do you see a lot of that? Or, I would imagine to get that qualifying score, that's what you would see, a sophomore needing to learn.
Yeah, it depends what the qualifying score is, right? So, the qualifying score for, a men's basketball player at UConn looks very different than a women's soccer player at Yale, right? And what those the qualifying scores are relevant. Often, by the way, if you get recruited by a Harvard, Yale, whoever has really high academic standards, they'll tell you, you need to get this in the SAT, right? So it's going to be different from the NCAA qualifying score, but they're going to tell you, you need to get a 1250. If you don't get a 1250, there's nothing we can do because their admissions counselors said, listen, we can't let someone in below a 1250, even if they can be the best soccer player in the world. It doesn't matter. They have to be a 1250. So those qualifying scores are different, and depending on which one you're talking about is how you have to prepare, right? Lots of students who are going to get a good score in the SAT can get an NCAA qualifying score when they're freshmen. They can go and take the test, get the score, everything's good if they're that kind of athlete. Whether they should take the test again or not and potentially open up other opportunities, a whole conversation we can have, but they're going to be able to get that score. It's different than I have to go get a 1300 because of my athletic profile, my academic profile to get me into Harvard, right? Because they want me as an athlete, and that just depends. So for those 1300s, if we're taking a little bit earlier, the content's really going to matter. So that's when you would end up teaching content.
So piggybacking on the timeline idea, so you've got you've got a junior who's taking them in June, May, late spring, like you said. What are you finding the senior coming back and taking them in October after having the summer off and coming back as far as subject matter? Are those scores a lot better? Or do you see if they?
So I take the SAT in May, and I come back and I'm gonna take it again in October. So what I'd highly recommend, and we'll talk a little bit about this, is you don't take that time off. Right, that summer is an awesome time to study and do much better on the test because you don't have the same academic pressures on you between June and August as you do between September and June, right? So that time shouldn't be a time to take off. It should be a time to think, okay, I now have 4 months. I know where my starting place is. I know where I want my ending place to be. I can put together a plan that will hopefully help me achieve that, right? And that might be, I spend 2 hours with a tutor and I spend 10, 15 hours on my own, right? Studying, should be guided by whoever you guys work with, per week. Per week. Not total, that'd be awesome. Probably wouldn't be a business then, but that's okay.
Good point.
You spend, that's right. So, but you spend that time and say, okay, I have this goal and I'm gonna go and achieve that goal.
But it's not, Mike's point about goal, it's not random. It's not going to have the structure of taking a course with a teacher at the front of the class every single day. But it's, here are my gaps. Here's where I'm going to focus. Here's how I'm going to get there, and then holding yourself accountable to doing all those things and seeing whether it's working by taking intermittent diagnostics to make sure that you're tracking. And all of that gives you an entire other semester to increase your score. And I would say, anecdotally, the students that do that, by and large, they increase their scores.
So the thing just to caveat that a little bit, the thing I see sometimes is students will come, they'll take the SAT, they'll done some little bit of tutoring beforehand, they'll come to Lion and they'll say, hey, I want some tutoring, I want to improve my score. And they'll come in and all they do is spend an hour and a half a week with us.
Right, that's not the plan.
And then they do better, but they're disappointed with how much better they do, right? Because there's only so much that we or any tutoring company can do with a student in a given time, right? And a lot of that work has to happen outside of what they do with us to improve their score. So that's the caveat I see. Like I've had students who get a 1380 and like, I think if I really study, if I do this plan, I'm gonna get a 1550, and all they do is an hour and a half and they get a 1420 and they're disappointed. I'm like, well, that's what's gonna happen.
It's the lacrosse analogy, you guys, right? I mean, you can't just show up for practice every day. You have to do it on your own. Same thing.
Yeah.
So 2 questions, just following up on this. Does the SAT allow you to, like, let's say, and maybe it depends on school, like, okay, school may say, I need you to get a certain score in your verbal.
Yep.
Can you split your, when you take?
Can you super score your
Well,
test?
can you say, like, let's say what you got on your math was acceptable, and you need to work on the verbal. Can you retake the test and focus in on that to then combine tests? Because I remember that's how it used to be.
You still can do that, right? With the there's a couple caveats there. One is, if you're an athlete, they'll let you do lots of things, right? So that's totally something you can do to get that qualifying score that they'll be fine with. If you're a regular admit to a top tier university, they're going to consider that, right? Because now you're sending in both those scores, and they'll be like, okay, we got an 800 on math this time and a 400 on verbal, and then the next time 800 on verbal and a 400 on math. Okay, they're really a 1200 SAT. They're not a 1600 SAT. They definitely consider that at the top universities.
And you mentioned before you can use the PSAT or something as an indicator for ACT diagnostic, or I don't know.
So what I was saying is, the nice thing is you have a standardized test that almost every high schooler takes their sophomore year. That's a pretty good indicator of roughly how you're going to do on standardized tests. Gives you a rough idea of what you get on the SAT, and you can see roughly what that is equivalent to on the ACT. I'd still take diagnostics to see if that's actually true or not, but you have a rough starting place of like, okay, I'm roughly at a 30 on the ACT and a 1370 or so on the SAT, and you know that going in, right? So it doesn't tell you what you get on the ACT, but it gives you a rough starting place of how you're doing on standardized tests. And it's the first time for most students that they've been in that environment where they're sitting there being timed and there's some pressure on the test.
When you say, Mike, it's more probabilistically an indicator of sort of the lower bound, not the bottom, but the lower bound for them.
Yeah, and what your trajectory is. That's right. Because if you take sophomore and junior year, if you see a big delta on there, which a lot of times students do, because those sophomore year classes are really the first, at beginning of junior year, kind of the first classes really preparing them for those tests. Everything before that is.
Yeah, the less like logistical advice and the more human advice is like, don't freak out if you do poorly on that first PSAT, or even your first diagnostic. I'm very empathetic. I did horribly on both, and then really well. Just worked, and I had the right tutors and all that kind of stuff when I was your age. And then there were folks that got 1400 and then got 1400, half a year later or a year later on the SATs. Everyone's very different. Your learning style, what you need in order to get there. But to Mike's point, if you do really well, that's great. And if you don't, it just means that you've got a little bit more work to do.
So for PSAT and SAT, is it equal now with the 1600 SAT?
Yeah, it's roughly equivalent. You'll know what you roughly would get on an SAT. That's right. The tests are still a little bit different, but you'll have a good idea.
Yeah, the idea is that if you took the SAT a week later with no additional work, it should be indicative. Yeah.
Right.
How many freshmen and sophomores do we have in here?
I think it's all.
Everybody. And how many people going through the recruiting process do we have? Anyone?
Everyone.
Everyone to a certain extent?
Yeah.
Early on, but yeah, okay. It's just helpful for us to know. Okay.
Cool.
Interesting.
So we spent a bunch of time in standardized tests, which is great, but as I said when we started the presentation, it's just one factor in your college application. Academics is another massive one, which we'll talk a little bit about now. Grades ultimately are the most important part of college admissions. It shows a track record of 4 years as opposed to one day, right? So having a good grade point average, doing well in classes across the 4 years is really important. So one thing that I see students often do, a lot of you are freshmen and sophomores. As a freshman or sophomore, you don't think about, okay, my grades now, colleges are going to look at them 3 years from now and determine whether I should go to that university or not, right? So having a plan in terms of like, okay, every class I take is important. it's important because it contributes to my GPA, and also having a plan in terms of what classes you're going to take, and having a challenging academic schedule over your 4 years is really important. Colleges ultimately want to see that you challenge yourself, that you took hard classes, and what they're looking at is, can you do the college work? So the more opportunities you have to do college work, the better. So on that, just to go into that a little bit more, there's 5 core areas in your academic transcript. So they're going to look at math, science, English, social studies, and foreign language. That doesn't mean that other electives aren't important because they contribute to your GPA, but they're looking at your GPA across these areas more. So if you load up your schedule with band and art because you're good at that, like great, but they're not going to consider that as heavily as your scores in these 5 areas. Then the other thing that they're going to look at is, have you taken honors classes? Have you taken advanced placement classes? Have you challenged yourself? Right? They're going to always look at that relative to what your school offers. Most colleges, especially for schools in the Northeast, have an idea of how students perform there, what classes are offered there, and how students do for those. So they're going to consider that. So if you have AP chemistry and you only took honors chemistry, they're going to know that, right? So challenging yourself for things that you can do well at and pushing yourself as much as you can is really important to show that you're capable of doing that work and challenging yourself overall.
Yeah, go ahead.